Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Voices of CIVICA podcast series. Today we're coming to you from the Central European University in Vienna, and this episode is about food. Specifically, the strange gap between what we eat and what we know. Food systems are roughly responsible for 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. The science on plant-based diets is clear, and yet our institutions, such as universities, policymakers, and cafeterias, aren't really moving. So, that gap between the evidence and between what ends up on our plate is what this conversation is about. So, let's get into it. I'm Daan van den Bergen. I'm an environmental science student at Central European University, and I'm an active member of the Plant-Based University campaign. It's a broad movement all over Europe, and I'm joined here today by Jana Stamm. She's a sustainability expert and founder of the Sustainable Science-Based Nutrition Institute, who brings us the corporate and science angle. Do you want to say something to our guests?
Hi, thank you for having me.
Then we have Felix Hnat, president of the European Vegetarian Union and chairman of the Vegan Society of Austria, and someone who has spent decades running campaigns and working directly with food service providers.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here.
And then finally, last but not least, we have Anke Schaffartzik. I hope I pronounced it correctly. You're a professor here at CU, and your research is about social metabolism, ecological economics, and I think you can help us understand that food is not just a diet question, but more also like a systems question, right? Well, first we'll dig into the science, and Jana, as someone, there's a lot of students who are genuinely trying to make better choices in their life, right? To try to be more sustainable. What does the data actually say? If you can choose tomorrow what you're going to eat, what is like the most sustainable thing to eat?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is because I have been giving presentations about like ecological impacts of the food sector, and when I have a bit more time, I always start with asking students or the audience, what do they connect like with when it comes to like sustainability and the food sector, and a lot of times they say organic food or regional food choices, the role of packaging. And sometimes people would say also eating less meat. So what I find is that there's really like a gap. So there's not like a lot of knowledge on what would be most impactful. And when we look at science, we can see like two categories of measurements. So we can talk about like agricultural practices, so more like the systemic side, and we can talk about consumers' choices. So the biggest two leverages that we have is the dietary patterns moving towards more plant protein, moving away from animal products, but also food waste, which is 53% of it happening in Europe in private households. So that is also a consumer's choice. So these are the two things, and if we take that together, we can really reduce massively our impact that we currently have with our food system, being the one single sector responsible for, or like being the largest contributor to exceeding planetary boundaries. So not only talking about climate, but also like the impact we have on biodiversity, on water use, on land use, on chemical use, on soil health. So it's massive, and I think it's important to also include these aspects as well, where the food sector is crucial actually.
Absolutely. Something I also often hear as a student is like people who try to be good, but they are like, oh, I'll try to eat local or like organic. There's a lot of different ideas about what is truly sustainable. What do you think are the biggest like misconceptions regarding sustainable nutrition?
So that's an important question because people do want to make better choices, but then like you're overwhelmed, right? You're at the supermarket and you're like, okay, so I have to reduce packaging. Maybe it should be organic, and then they don't know what to do. So a huge underestimation, or no, actually overestimation, is the role of the transport sector. Mm-hmm. So when we have talks about climate, we usually focus on the transport sector and obviously the energy sector, but we never really talk about the food system. But when we look at the food system and within the food system at the role of the transport, it makes up roughly 5% of emissions within the food sector, which is massive in general. So, for example, if I choose between a steak that I buy that is transported from Argentina or a steak that was produced here in Austria, the difference is 0.5% in emissions.
Wow.
So it's not really a leverage that we have. But I do understand the logic. So like people would think, okay, the transport is a problem. So if my food, let's say if I eat an avocado and it's been transported from Mexico to here, that needs to be problematic. But actually looking at the data, it's not. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge knowledge gap kind of. That's one thing. Then, for example, the role of organic food choices. Organic, it's a bit controversial because we have around 20 to 50% higher land use. So we need way more land to produce the same amount of food. So actually, if on a global scale we switched all our agriculture to organic agriculture, we would have a super big problem with land use. We already use around 50% of habitable land to produce our food. So if we switch that to organic agriculture, that would be a massive pressure on ecosystems that is already there. So, but that's something that you need to look into and that you need to have awareness. And in my experience, even speaking to people that have been working in sustainability consulting for many years, with a focus on the food sector, like if you put the global perspective and the role of the food system there, they're often surprised. So there's really knowledge gap.
Yeah. Anke, about that knowledge gap, your research, you look at the society through a lens of resource flows, land, energy, materials. What is it that like a typical, like carbon footprint analysis of the food is missing if we really want to look at the sustainability of for instance, our food system?
You mean like what the carbon footprint in terms of like what we see sometimes in supermarket labeling, what we're not getting with that? I think that's an area where I can sort of follow up on what Jana has been saying, because of course this the intention behind these labels and providing the information on the footprint, so on the resource use that was associated upstream with anything we buy, providing that to the consumers is nice in the spirit of transparency, but at the end of the day, it still leaves the consumer standing in the supermarket, having to compare the labels, having to do the work of figuring out what is a sustainable option here, and also what is a more sustainable alternative to what I'm looking to buy, right? So it puts a lot of the responsibility for what we're actually looking for is systemic change, and then it winds up putting it back with the individual, right? So I think this is an area where if we look at it also from a research perspective, we have to say that there's a bit of a mismatch between what we observe, which is that these are system-wide properties that need system-wide solutions, and then expecting an individual doing their daily grocery shopping in a supermarket to be able to make that change happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very interesting approach to look at, like, how much do we require individuals to change and how much can we more look at regulation and other ways. Felix, I was wondering, so you've been in this space a long time, right, as a president of the European Vegetarian Union, and probably you've talked to a lot of different people, also policymakers. What are some of those like stubborn myths that you sometimes hear about the environmental impact of plant-based foods, and where do these myths originate from?
When I talk to stakeholders from gastronomy or food service sector, they mentioned is what Jana already mentioned with the regionality, so the distance of the production of food to where it's produced and where it's consumed. That's one of the biggest misconceptions. Also, there are arguments sometimes like you hear soy is not good because the soy you eat in the tofu is from the rainforest, but the opposite is the truth. The soy from rainforest or from GMO modified production is that the one that we feed to the animals, which people do not consider. And the soy for products for human consumption is 50% organic and almost most of the time from Europe or Austria even. Austria is the third biggest soy producer in Europe in the meantime.
Wow, I've never heard about it. Yeah, well, but where do these like myths then come from? Because I heard you also talking about, so the EU is changing their policy regarding the names of certain plant-based food, like a plant-based sausage can't be called a sausage anymore, or there has been a lot of changes. And I was wondering, like, is there like a big lobby behind pushing back against this protein shift that we're seeing?
Some of the myths we are talking about exist for a very long time. That I would say it's a mixture between tradition and also lobbyists who really disseminate this kind of information. There was a big investigation when the Eat Lancet report came out. They found out afterwards that there were lobbyists and influencers paid by lobbyists to disseminate fake news concerning that. And that's a problem we have to face.
Yeah. What, like, just a general question for everyone. So we are all working within certain institutions. We're here at Central European University, but at corporations, other institutions, or even at EU level, like, although the science is so clear, why is a change not happening yet? Because it's not that we have to wait for like more solar panels to be installed, or, you know, like, it is more about behavioral change, and institutions could theoretically play a leading role. Does any one of you want to share some thoughts on like why, like what is missing? Why is there such a lag between knowing something and doing?
I think what I mentioned at the beginning, I think there's a huge knowledge gap. Like from my experience, really working with people in sustainability departments, there is that knowledge gap of how important it actually is. So I think that needs to be the first steps where in society or like institutions could actually, and universities could play a significant role. So for example, since I've been working with many organizations, what you can do is have like internal trainings about environmental impacts and compare different sectors and like really show the leverages that you have. Because like, for example, I've been also teaching teachers kind of about sustainability, and what they said to me is like, we never learned that when we were at university back then, and for us it's too much time to investigate all that, to be able to present it to the students, to really understand all these complex issues, you know. So there's really that gap, and I think that's the first step. And that's something that every organization can take part of. And what I can see in the business world is that it's becoming more and more a trend to have these like internal programs for employees where they can talk about sustainability and have experts coming in, and then also start initiatives, demand like from your company that they focus more on climate-friendly food choices when you have an event. And I think that's kind of what has to happen to have like a transformation. You know, it needs to be normal that if you go to an event, there's not always a meat option, but the focus is on plant protein. What also needs to be normal is that if you have an event, the idea of how can we prevent food waste, maybe always have like little paper boxes, or actually talk to the participants, be like, hey, you can bring your plastic boxes and take some food home afterwards. And that's a process. That's how society changes. Like, it needs to be normalized. It needs to be connected. Like, hey, if we have an event, we need to think about food waste, and we need to think about plant protein. Another thing that we've talked before is also that the more sustainable choices with, for example, having a focus on plant protein need to be appealing. If we have a salad as a choice, or some potatoes with tomato sauce, that's not appealing, you know. But if you have a nice soy schnitzel and like some innovative sauce, like something, I want to try this, and I think this is how it works, you know.
So yeah. I hear that first we have to close a knowledge gap, and then at the same time we have to make it more interesting, appealing, maybe even economically more attractive than the other options. Anke,
can I, without you asking further questions, can I quickly jump in? Because I wanted to pick up on something that Jana actually mentioned in addition to these 2 points, and which I think is also extremely important. I have 2 children, and it's relevant in this context because, oh my gosh, the difference between whether I tell them that they should be doing something and what they take from that, or whether they see me doing something. And I think this is something that is so far spread and so true that what you're saying, this point of changing practices is so important also in making sure that the information we have can be conveyed in kind of the full extent of its meaning, right? Because it's the same thing if we have politicians who are, they stand on a stage and they say we have to combat the climate crisis, and then they go and they take their private jet to fly somewhere, right? Because it's more convenient. That leaves the audience with the feeling of, well, if they're still doing it, it can't be that bad. They wouldn't do it if it were really so dangerous for us. And I think the same thing is true with animal product consumption, and that it has to be it has to happen first of all, and then it has to be very visible and it has to be appealing. Which is also why I think the Plant-Based Universities campaign is really important, because it's something that creates visibility and that says, okay, the people doing the research are also going to act differently. And then the other thing I think is that sometimes we don't yet fully consider just how culturally ingrained this is. Of course, also, quote unquote, thanks to the work of lobbies in sort of creating a certain imagery, especially around meat, but then also around milk and dairy. If we look at certain campaigns in Austria, right, basically giving, for example, women the idea that they're not feeding their families well if they're not giving them meat and milk, and giving, in particular, men the idea that they're not real men if they're not eating meat, right? And I think that this is something where there's a feminist political economist, Cara Daggett, who's done some work on what she calls petromasculinity, where she says that actually, she argues that fossil fuel consumption, is very strongly tied up in ideas of masculinity and what it means to be like a real man, and like the kind of car you drive and the exhaust fumes coming out the back, and that you're a coal miner is like a very masculine thing. And I suspect that there's something quite similar going on around meat and meat consumption, right? And this is a huge problem, and it's tied up with patriarchal and even misogynist kind of structures that we have in society. And that's something that we sometimes lose sight of, right? Because I'm researching resource flows and land use, but this also matters, kind of how we organize our societies around cultural values.
Can I add to that? Because since it's many years of me giving these talks about ecological impact of the food systems, and then one big focus is on moving towards plant protein. And my experience really is that it's way more men having a problem with that information and asking weird questions afterward. And you could tell that there's some aversion to that message. So it's kind of my subjective experience as well. And then it's interesting because when you look at health data, because the good thing with this whole topic is that you don't only, you can bring these two things of planetary health and human health perfectly together. Because on the other hand, besides the food system being the biggest contributor to exceeding the planetary boundaries, unhealthy diets also pose a greater risk than other risk factors like consuming tobacco, alcohol, and drug use, and having unsafe sex together combined. So it's massive. It's also on the health perspective, it's a massive way to improve health. And then when it comes to masculinity, actually, there are some studies that show that consuming plant-rich diets lower the risk of having erectile dysfunction. And then if you mention that, usually it shifts a bit that, because it is a lot of times tied to masculinity, consuming meat. But actually looking at data, the opposite is the case, or an opposite direction, let's put it like that.
I personally couldn't agree more. Felix, have you also experienced that is very much tied to sometimes masculinity or these cultural stereotypes?
For sure, definitely. That's definitely the case. Additionally, I believe that one problem is that a lot of consumers are buying what is most available and what is the cheapest. So there is only a small group of consumers who really has the financial means and puts in the effort to make a sustainable choice. And so we have to change the system in some ways. That means plant-based products have to be more available and cheaper for a big audience. Some of the companies do progressive work. For example, if you look to IKEA, they sell 40% of the meatballs plant-based in the meantime, and I think that's about the potential the plant-based food has in the moment. But the problem is that a lot of companies, they do not really understand that the target group should be flexitarians or the mainstream. They mainly focus on the vegan group with marketing, and that's the reason they do not reach a big audience. And if it also comes to system change, we have to address policy. And policymakers in Europe are, in my opinion, 25 years behind the rest of the society if it comes to the topic of agriculture and plant-based. And that's mainly because of influence of lobbies, in my opinion.
Yeah, fascinating. So I hear that the people are actually leading the way and the policy is lagging a bit. And I think that's what they often call like the reducer approach, right? That not everyone has to become vegan from tomorrow onwards, but it's also a big win for climate and for animal rights if we collectively reduce, because that has a bigger impact if we collectively do that than when a small group turns completely vegan. I was wondering, because you've had already, all of you have already done so many great things, but as your background as an activist, have you learned things, or are there now things that if you look back at that you were like, I would have done that differently, or this approach does work in campaigning and this one is counterproductive?
I'm active now for about 20 years in that field, and I thought about that question before, and probably when I was 20 years younger, I focused very much on the why, on the reasons why we should change something, and now our work is focusing very much on the how to change, because a lot of people know about problems, but they left frustrated and they have the feeling they cannot change anything. And to show practical alternatives, work with best practices, what you actually can cook, where you can buy the stuff, etc. That's the focus of our work right now. I'm not saying that the why is not important, but it's much more credible if the why comes from universities or from science institutions than from NGOs. And also, it makes sense, or we found out after decades that it makes sense to work with multipliers and to work with institutional change more, and not to try to convince every single person to adapt a plant-based lifestyle, because if you reach 10 persons in the same time, then again change in the other direction. So it's almost impossible to come against the whole marketing industry of the food sector.
I believe that's exactly the approach that the Plant-Based University campaign is also following. So for our audience who might not know yet about the Plant-Based University campaign, it's a movement that started in the United Kingdom quite some time ago, and it spread rapidly around Europe. And personally, so I was always, as a climate activist, very caring about reducing fossil fuel emissions, and personal level maybe also, I was vegetarian, etc. And I never believed that it was like, always when people were like, you have to be vegan, I was like, oof, this sounds radical, this is too ideological, like, why should we do that? Until I went to a summer camp, and there I met a lot of really, really morally ambitious young people. So people who are not just waiting till someone else is going to save the planet, because I find an amazing quote. So the greatest danger to our planet is a belief that someone else will save it. Those students there, those 300 students who gathered last summer in a camp in Germany, they were all thinking exactly about the why, like, no, not about the why, but about the how, like how are we going to change our institutions? And it's super pragmatic, because in order to end the climate crisis, instead of just focusing on the individual level, the campaign is trying to push universities to practice what they teach. So to make their catering more sustainable as possible. And that's why it's called 100% plant-based, because you want to be as effective as possible. And if you start with asking for 20%, you'll end up with 2%. So I believe it's for real one of the most impactful things you can do as a student, but there are of course many other ways also to engage. And I was wondering, because Jana, you have probably similar experiences of trying to create this environment of change at, for instance, a big retailer company where you worked at, and now at a public institution, Geosphere. How would you compare your campaigning efforts with what is like the environment of a university, and what are like some struggles or opportunities you see at corporations to push for that change?
So, I mean, corporations, like depending on which market they operate, but the one that I was working in had a big focus on consumers and a direct contact to consumers. So obviously what's very important for them is always like, what reputation do we have? What do consumers demand from us? So just wanted to have like a little side note here, please, as consumers, always give feedback. It really matters, and it's really like an important driver for sustainability strategies to move forward. But I guess like universities, they rather have young people, and I think it's a more dynamic environment. So in large corporations or public institutions, you have like strong hierarchies. So sometimes it really depends on the commitment level and the openness of the senior management that you have to deal with. But I always recommend to like connect with colleagues that are as committed as you are about a certain topic, and really take some time to exchange like how can we move forward. Also, don't underestimate like the like being loud about something. So even if you're like out of 100 people in an organization, you're 5 people and you're committed, if you always make comments, it seems like it's a big movement, and that's what I have been doing, for example, and it works. I was on big events of an organization that I worked in, and I was with 2 more people always giving the same feedback, and they addressed it during the events. They're like, yeah, okay, we know that you want to have this event more climate friendly. We'll these are the steps that we've taken. So like, don't underestimate that power of feedback as a consumer, as an employee. If there is employee service, demand, that they also have more internal climate measurements, climate trainings that can be impactful. And that's like the little things that everybody of us can tackle, I think.
So I hear be loud, be visible, and make it enjoyable as well for yourself.
And connect with people that also want to change something, because you need to be motivated, and you need to have like a space where you can like, okay, so that's the pushback now, how can we move forward? Yeah,
because indeed you need to find allies. If you don't find people to do it with, you're just on your own, and it doesn't always work. Some arguments, because we've been running this campaign as well at our university, and other universities, we often hear people saying like, oh, this feels restrictive, or like I want at least the freedom of choice to choose a meat option. But I was wondering, like what are your thoughts on where does our personal freedom end, and like how can you counter such arguments? So why is a plant-based catering fully plant-based? Why can it still be inclusive?
I think if I had the perfect answer to that, then I would have already spread the word. Also at our university, but I think that there are 2 things that are important here. One clearly is also the language that we use around communication, right? So in these discussions that we've also had here at CEU, there have been voices of people who are opposed to this 100% plant-based. So they say that, I could go along with a smaller share. And then the interesting thing is that what I think people don't realize is that they're probably already at that smaller share, right? So that the idea around how substantial meat or animal products are in most of our meals is often very strongly exaggerated, right? People are even people that eat animal products are in essence flexitarians or omnivores in that sense. They're not meat eaters, right? So we eat plenty plant-based already, so that's sort of I think the one thing that's important to recognize, that there's already a substantial basis there, whether people like that label for themselves or not, of plant-based. And then I think the other thing maybe also has to do a bit with the recommendations, Jana, that you've already been given, but that if we look kind of through the history of social movements and impactful social movements, right, there are so many examples across contexts, across countries, across time periods, where kind of big social change came about, and research has found that the average support initially is around 3% of the population, right? So that's something that I find extremely helpful, because it's exactly this. It's sort of we hear the naysayers, or those who are opposed to change, right? We hear them so loudly. Because they're
loud.
They're loud. They're loud. Exactly. They're often also loud in other contexts, and then maybe we also overestimate the role that their resistance can have. And I really like your idea of, well, let's flip the script. Then let's be the ones who are loud, and let's make them overestimate how loud the voices, or how big the movement for change is. So I do agree that's really important. And I realize that I've now sort of sidled my way out of answering that question, but I think it's the best I can do at the moment.
No, I think that 3% is really interesting. Like that with a small group of very enthusiastic and motivated people, you can really do a lot, right? You don't need to wait till you have 50% of people finally be agreeing. But I was wondering, you must have heard that argument as well, Felix, like the inclusivity argument, or like how to. Yeah, when people tell you, oh, it's too dogmatic, for instance, like why 100% strictly? Why not just once a week?
I guess you can have a lot of answers to this. Basically, if you, for example, look at the average we are consuming right now, even if it comes to the planetary health diet, or if it comes to the dietary guidelines or whatever, we eat much more. And then you can say, if it's about the average of every person, and this is just one meal a day, it just brings down the average. But it is really true that the freedom of choice is something which can make people very angry if they have the feeling you take it away. So that's something definitely you have to plan and communicate very good.
Yeah. And an argument that I often use when talking to university students is that, you're not telling them, restricting them in any way. You're just making it possible for them to contribute in a positive way to our climate system, because they can still eat whatever they want at home. It's maybe a few meals a year, or like not all students eat at the university anyway. And then also regarding allergens, for instance, if you look at the 14 major allergens in the UK, I think 5 or 8 of them are related to meat-based products. So there's
religious restrictions as well. So like
absolutely.
Plant-based food is automatically halal. It's kosher. What else do we have?
It doesn't include pork.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it is quite inclusive.
Yeah. No, and I think that's one of the strong points as well of it. And regarding creating these changes, how? And I heard the word before already, like the nudging. You've a lot of experience with that. Could you maybe explain this, like what are like the best practices that you've learned, and how to implement these changes, even without some people knowing that it's happening, without all the marketing towards vegans specifically?
Yeah, nudging is about studies and experiences about consumer choices, and what you can do to bring consumers to make, for example, more sustainable choices. And there is a lot of experience and studies in the field of plant-based diets and canteens. For example, the menu design. If you have main dishes on one hand and vegetarian and salad on the other hand, and if you have a plant-based dish in the vegetarian section or in the main section, it is ordered much more if it's in the main section, because then it's considered from the people who read the menu as a main dish or the default option. Some hospitals, like in Villach, for example, or in Denmark, the hospital of Bispebjerg, they have 3 options, like with meat but a bit with less salt, and vegetarian. And most of them have, if people come to the hospital and don't have a choice what they order because they just checked in or they are too weak to choose something, they get the meat option, and that's the worst you can do. And some of the hospitals like Villach or Bispebjerg, they switched it around and they just got 20% meat reduction by just making the vegetarian the default option. You also can nudge with the price. We know it from retailers that the biggest reason which is hindering people to taste plant-based options is the price. That's what the people scares the most. And if you solve that problem, you have to have a good quality of food and a good taste that they buy it again. And also the way food is labeled. For example, the word vegan or vegetarian, or also health restrictive vocabulary, it makes people come up with some feelings they have inside. They, for example, think that food or ingredients which do taste good are missing, or it's not fat, it's not salty, then it won't be good. And or you associate it with ideologies, like if pasta is labeled as vegan, then you consider thoughts like, I'm not really vegan, that's nothing for me. And that means if it comes to names, how to describe dishes in a menu, it's important to have words which describe the taste, the mouthfeel, the origin of the recipe or the origin of the ingredients, so that everyone can imagine something, a taste and an experience you have, but not just use categories.
Yeah. You remind me of a little anecdote of my brother, for instance. So the favorite restaurant of my family, my father, my sister, and me, is a plant-based restaurant in the beautiful city of Mechelen in Belgium. But my brother, just because of this ideological resistance, like the idea that there's no meat option there, it's fully plant-based, makes him afraid to go there. So he never stepped in the food because he's so afraid that once we go with him, that we'll never go anywhere else anymore, and maybe that he'll fall in love with the food. Who knows? And I find that an interesting one, and that's why I wonder. So this campaign that we're running at the universities, it's called Plant-Based Universities. Do you think it's a good idea to call it plant-based instead of vegan universities?
Yes, definitely. I mean, on my business card, it says Vegan Society Austria, but the name we chose 20 years ago, and today we would do it differently perhaps. But plant-based is a very good word because it's more approachable and it's less ideologic and it's not so emotionally loaded. So I think it's the best choice to say plant-based universities instead of vegan universities.
I think also at a university it makes more sense. But like when I have strategies in corporations or other organizations, I usually go for sustainable or climate-friendly choices because people have that aversion, and also because it's not about it is showing the leverage. Okay, if we go fully plant-based, it's the maximum of leverage that we have. But it's also if we choose chicken instead of beef, if we choose more vegetarian options, it's also going into the right direction, and that's what we at least need to have as well. So that's kind of what I really recommend in these organizational contexts to. That's invite hey, let's look at the food system and then decide together where we go. But I think for universities it makes sense.
Would someone maybe want to explain for the difference between vegan and plant-based? Because when I first heard it, I was like, wait, isn't it just the same? And then I realized, oh wait, veganism is about way more. And I think you all have different maybe ideas or thoughts about it, but I'm curious to hear how you would explain veganism in a
I think our expert is Felix.
I would agree.
In my opinion, in the daily language people use, it's more or less the same.
Yeah.
But veganism also has some philosophical or ideological elements, and especially vegan people interpret very much into it sometimes. So probably if you ask a lot of people, you will get different replies. But I think if you make a survey in the society, most people would say it's the same. But still, there was one study, and that's the funny thing about it. They ask, what do you think tastes better, plant-based spaghetti or vegan spaghetti? And 70% of the people said plant-based.
No way.
Yeah.
No way.
That's the problem.
It was the same spaghetti.
Yes, for
Wow.
sure. It's just the emotions that are getting
So
in the
fascinating.
heads.
And I think that point of the emotions, especially here at the university, is one that is extremely important and is extremely under-recognized as well. Because in both kind of for advocating for a plant-based university and in the resistance against it, emotions play such a strong role, right? And at the same time, we're at a university and we don't talk about our emotions, right? We're always rational.
Super
Everything
rational.
is purely science-based. And I think that that's a huge discrepancy, that we're not at a point yet where across the board we're willing to recognize that, yes, we are rational, but we're also emotional. And both is important, right? And kind of not, it's not that the rational always supersedes the emotion. So emotions are there for a reason, but then we have to be able to name them and to recognize them. And I mean, imagine if we were able to like speak to people who hear this idea of plant-based and who are, no, I will always be against this, and you are taking away my schnitzel. And imagine like we could openly talk to them. What are you so scared about? Like, what are you afraid of? And they could tell us.
Yeah.
That would change so much. But of course, I mean, again, and this is also very strongly tied up, of course, with masculinity and with there being not just this dualism between rational and emotional, but also this being a hierarchical dualism in the sense that the rational is better than the emotional, right? And it's more important.
Wow.
I think there is few topics where it's as emotional as this, because it is so, like, our food choices and particularly consume animal products are so tied to our personal values. So we like feel personally attacked, and like, you know, we have to make decisions and like also have, you know, a judgment about, okay, maybe I've done it wrong until now, and you know, it's a super emotional topic. And like, if you talk about other strategies, like, okay, we need to tackle food waste, it's not emotional. People are like, amazing, let's do this. It's so easy. And this one, it's a bit challenging. And I think we also need more. There is some research already, but we need more research, and we can apply that research to other more sustainable behavioral choices as well.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more actually with what you all said. And I think one of the challenges is creating that safe environment, that safe space where you can like openly talk without being confrontational. And I think for that, like having more one-on-one conversations, asking about it, like maybe even like, that's what I did with a lot of my friends. I just cooked plant-based for them without like marketing it. So that's a way to nudge. And they were like, oh, wait, this is actually really tasty. And then that completely changes their mind. And then they're also able to detach that strong emotion of what is connected to the food. Something else.
Well, and also, I mean, just to add on that, because what you've been doing with the campaign at CEU, right? So they had a few events here, and then they always provided like a plant-based buffet, and they had cookies, and to give people exactly the sense that you're not about taking something away from them. You're about, as you've already said, about offering them other options and about giving them something and caring for them and caring for the world that they live in. I think that does reframe it, and then it's still, of course, saddening and frustrating to see that even that can be met with resistance. But I still think it's the right way to go.
Absolutely, I think that's a magic recipe. So first, try something that it's very tasty, and while you're eating that, you can ask the person, so do you want healthier food? Yeah, of course I want healthier food. Do you want food that is also tastier? Yeah, it's super tasty, of course. And do you want food that is also helping to tackle the climate crisis? Yeah, sure, okay, let's do it, you know. And then you can completely detach those two things from each other. And you can even detach it from their personal daily choices, because it's about institutional change. And I think that's where the power comes from a lot. One struggle.
Can I add something to that? I think big corporations also have a big power on normalizing certain topics. And I think it's very positive that companies like IKEA or Lidl or other companies, they have jumped because of the environmental impacts, and they know about it. They've made campaigns on Veganuary and like, oh, these are our vegan products. I think it really helps because they have by far a bigger budget than any movement could have to normalize, like IKEA kind of has like a positive branding, they have like the Swedish and good design and all that. So if they go along and like, hey, so we are part of Veganuary and we have these vegan products now, it normalizes that topic. And I think it's really helpful for the whole transition if more corporations would normalize that.
Absolutely. Although one of the things when we try to, although there's a lot of enthusiasm, sometimes even within our university or other institutions, sometimes we have these like practical issues of, for instance, a cost. And I was wondering if you think that at one point in time, or maybe already right now, that plant-based food could become like economically by default the cheapest option. So in theory, the catering that is plant-based should be cheaper, right? Because you have less meat, etc. And you don't have to grow an animal in between. You can just directly eat the food. But it
depends, I think. Like, yes, lentils and beans are cheap, but it depends on what you want to offer. If you want to have plant-based cream, unfortunately, right now it's still more expensive. But I think it will get cheaper because of economies of scale. And unfortunately now most of the products are still niche products. So they're produced at a smaller scale. And that's why they're more expensive. But what we can see is over the past years, because particularly like in German-speaking countries, there has been an increase in the number of vegetarians and flexitarians and vegans. And like, let's say like 10 years ago, you would pay €3 for an oat milk and it was not even that good. And now all the big retailers offer oat milk for like €1.20. So we already see a decrease, and I think it will decrease even more if we apply economies of scale.
Oh, I heard.
Well, and relatively speaking, I mean, I think animal products and meat generally is held artificially cheap, right?
Exactly.
I mean, I'm
heavily
not
subsidized.
Exactly. I'm not. I'm absolutely not against interventions into the market. I don't want to advocate free market here, but we sort of pretend it's a free market, and then say, oh, plant-based is more expensive, perhaps in some contexts than animal products. But then we ignore that it's actually not a free market and that it's heavily subsidized. That in some instances the retail tax rates are different for plant-based and animal-based products, especially in Austria, which has an impact on the price for the consumer, right? So I think it's also about realistically reflecting the cost of things, right? And I mean, the plight of livestock farmers in Austria at the moment, it's already really difficult, right? And then kind of I think it's also possible to discuss kind of what are the limitations of this system, right? And are you being held in a system that actually is not good for you or anyone through these subsidies and through price
and then the
making.
environmental costs are all externalized, so taxpayers pay for it, and it's a huge thing in Europe because we produce so much of animal products.
Yeah. Another thing I was wondering, so what we often don't talk about it, because that's even more connected to like the emotions, is like all the cruelty or the suffering of animals involved in this whole thing. And that's exactly because of what you said, because of the highly industrialized way we have to produce cheap meat right now. The only way to do it is by causing a lot of suffering, because many people have this idealized version of, oh, a few cows and then a happy cow and at the end we'll eat it. But that's like an image that's also being put forward by the lobby. But in reality, I wonder, like, I don't think, like, do you think for the people even working in these spaces that it's a good working environment? Like,
I think it's really tricky because I think, of course, it's tied up in so much of especially farms that are essentially run by families, have been in families for generations, are looked after by a generation with the idea that the next generation will take it over, without kind of knowing whether this is really what the next generation wants. But I think there's so much that's tied up in that, and that it can be really difficult, to say that to someone, okay, you're raising these dairy cows and you're doing all of the extremely hard labor, which I would agree is not fun, but they're doing it out of a sense of duty. And then someone says, well, actually, please don't feed those oats to the cows. I'll just make the milk directly, right? It's sort of, it's tough. And I think kind of to revisit what the agricultural system currently looks like, and to create kind of opportunities and choices there would be really important. And I realize we don't have the time now, but I think this discussion of not just what could plant-based or more plant-based consumption look like, but what could more plant-based production look like, is a discussion that really needs to happen, especially in countries like Austria, where agricultural production is just so predominant.
But can I say something about that? Because I don't have the exact numbers right now, but I think most of the animal products that we have here on the market are like, I don't know, at least 90% industrialized farming. And where we have like hundreds of animals in a small space. So it's not really the image of like that family farm,
Yeah, but most family farms are only viable now if they have upwards of 200 head, I think, for cows. So I think it's sort of exactly so I'm saying families, and it is family run, but it's not, doesn't mean they have 3 cows in the stable, right? So it's still, it's large scale production, yeah.
Unfortunately, I think we should definitely make another episode about food system now, because now we've focused a lot on like, okay, behavior, choices, institutions, how can we change from the bottom up perspective, but also top down, like policy-wise, what should change. I want to finish with a short question for all of you. We can go one by one. And for all the students that are listening, well, like, what would be your advice for them so as a student, we're often looking at the news and it's discouraging, but what would be your advice to them for how to, move a little stone in the river? If you could go back to your student time, what would you want to hear?
Also, as a consuming student, I believe it's important not to underestimate the choices you can do, because it's just perhaps one dish per day, but in 1 year, it's a few hundred. And also you are an example, like we heard before. And for students who want to change something and want to be activists, it's important not to be frustrated too quick, to look at longer periods of time, to look what you can achieve in 3 or 5 years, and not to be frustrated if something doesn't work. And in the last 2 weeks, you're working on something and you see no progress. So to have a long time perspective always, to get some motivation and to exchange with others, to also have a good environment, and also to be aware of the energy you have, because activism is a marathon and not a sprint.
Wow, wonderful. Jana?
Yeah, I mean, I would tell students really focus on sustainable food systems, because it's one area where we really need that transition, where everybody can take a role, and compared to other sectors like the energy sector or the transport sector, where there is policy needed, there is an infrastructure needed, food system, there's all of us needed. So really look at what role you can play to push that topic into a positive direction.
I think one of the things that I see happens with students who I accompany and who I teach is that actually they come to the university and they study and they learn about the world beyond what they were able to imagine before, and all of them become aware of how privileged they are, but also at the same time, of course, of how others are more privileged. And I think sort of one of the most important things you can take away from being at a university and having the experience of being able to study is to understand this privilege, and then to use it not only to go forth and take a fancy job that will earn a lot of money, but then also to think, okay, you have this privilege of relative freedom, and then how can you use it to support someone else's freedom, right? And that can be through all manner of activism, and of course, animal rights activism is one way that you can use your freedom to kind of, how can you now free someone else? And I think that's also something that can help a little bit against feelings of, guilt around, oh, I'm so much more privileged, but then use the little bit of privilege that you have.
Yeah, I would love to add on to that. So I think we as students, we should stop, not stop, but focus maybe less on our own ecological footprint and the harmful parts of that, but also look at our handprint and all the positive change we can push for together, not alone, but find students to do it with together, make it fun, make it your best friend group. And indeed, as you said, it's a marathon and not a sprint. Thank you so much for listening, and hope you'll also listen to the other episodes of the Voices of CIVICA podcast.